Yeah? On the beaches, too. Okay. Yeah. June 15th, 1940. This week, Paris falls. What more can I say? I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the big news was the completion of the Allied evacuation from Dunkirk, nearly 340,000 people. The Allies also evacuated their final troops from Norway. The Japanese were advancing in China, and the Germans were advancing in France. Here's what follows. There are some endings and some beginnings this week. On the 10th, the Northern Campaign officially ends as Norway surrenders to Germany. The same day, Italy declares war on France and Britain. Italian leader Benito Mussolini wants a piece of military glory. But the Italian economy doesn't seem really ready for war. The Italians do, however, have a strong and strategically placed fleet, including 116 submarines, the largest submarine fleet in the world. They do not have aircraft carriers, but the Italian Navy, when fully assembled, will be much larger than the French and British forces in the Mediterranean. The army, though large enough, is dreadfully equipped, however. But over 30 divisions of that army are on the Franco-Italian border and prepare to attack the thinly spaced defenders. The effect this declaration has in London is that all Italians between 16 and 70 who have resided in England for under 20 years are rounded up and interned, 4,100 of them. Italy has Eritrea as an African colony and conquered Ethiopia a few years ago, so Britain is Italy's neighbor there in British Somaliland and British East Africa. In North Africa, Italy has Libya and borders Egypt, only some 700 kilometers from the Suez Canal, vital to Britain. Well, on the 11th, the Italian Air Force bombs Port Sudan and Aden. Also, 8 separate raids are made on Malta, currently a British colony. In return, Turin and Genoa are bombed by the RAF. An Italian sub sinks the cruiser Calypso off Crete, so on the 14th, French cruisers and destroyers shell Genoa and Bodo. That day, the British 11th Hussars cross from Egypt to Libya and capture Fort Capuzzo. The French and British, though, still have a larger fight on their hands with the Germans. Last week, I said that today, I would talk in depth about Phase 2 of the German offensive in the West, Fall Rot, Case Red. As the Allies were finishing their evacuation from Dunkirk, the Wehrmacht wheeled to face south in a line along the northern banks of the rivers Somme, Ailette, and Aisne. They had 140 divisions on this line in Army Groups A and B. They were by now rested. The line facing them, the Weygand Line, stretched from the coast to Verdun and was the 10th, 7th, 6th, 2nd, and 3rd French armies from west to east. They number 49 divisions. Both sides took a lot of casualties in Phase 1. The German ones are 61,000, while the French are 370,000. Those figures according to Robert Jackson, though estimates vary between sources. Allied prisoners taken, though, are over 1 million by this point. France has also really suffered materially, losing 1/4 of its field guns and 1/3 of its armor. The German plan for June is for armor to again lead the attack, and I talked about this last week a bit. Hermann Hoth's 15th Corps would strike between Amiens and the sea. Ewald von Kleist's Panzer Corps across the Somme towards Peronne and Amiens, and Heinz Guderian's 2 Corps southward from the Aisne. The whole operation, though, began last week with airstrikes. 500 bombers and fighters took off back on the 3rd and made for Paris in Operation Paula. The idea was partly to destroy as much of the French Air Force's aircraft and airfields as possible, but also to sabotage French morale and isolate the city so it could be bypassed by the ground forces. French fighters, some 250 of them, flew out to meet the enemy, destroying 26 German planes and losing 17 of their own. And Operation Paula was a disappointment for the Germans. They only destroyed 16 grounded aircraft. And though they temporarily put 6 runways out of action, it was business as usual again within 48 hours, though the French took 254 civilian deaths and 652 more injured. Nor had Paris been isolated. The ground attack began the 5th, after an artillery barrage from Léon to the Channel against the French forces, which included the British 51st Highland Division. There were reinforcements for them en route, in the form of the 1st Canadian Division and the 52nd Lowland Division. The Allies were forced back, though they fought well and inflicted heavy casualties. The Germans, though, had managed to capture 2 intact railway bridges over the Somme, and Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had, by the end of the day, powered through Le Quesnoy into the Loudun Valley. He had, in fact, advanced so far that he was beyond the Luftwaffe bombing line, and there was a danger he'd be attacked by German dive bombers if he went further, so he halted and consolidated. As Robert Jackson writes, by his daring thrust across country, Rommel had succeeded in making nonsense of the whole defensive policy of the Weygand Line. This relied not on a continuous front, but on a network of hedgehogs dotted over the countryside, with the defending troops well dug in. Wherever possible, each hedgehog was situated in a position that enabled it to provide covering fire for its neighbors. Although the Weygand Line had been designed to give some semblance of defense in depth, it was by no means proof against the strong armored thrust of the type in which Rommel specialized. And that's the thing, it is not a true defense in depth. Still, it was kind of working the first day or two anyhow. Except for Rommel's sector, no one made any significant progress, and the French fought brilliantly against heavy odds. And after just 2 days, half of von Kleist's Panzer Corps was disabled. But Rommel again kept things going. He covered nearly another 50 kilometers the 6th and dove into the French 10th Army. On the 7th, he pushed in the center, and by the 8th, and it was a rout by then, reached Elbe on the Seine. Apparently, the speed of his advance so confused the locals that a woman came up to the command vehicle and asked if he was English. Behind him on his flank, Rouen fell that morning, and on his other flank, Manstein's infantry had reached the lower Seine, and by cutting through the center of the 10th Army, they had now succeeded in cutting off the French 9th Corps, which included the 51st Highland, between Rouen and Dieppe, and surrounding them by the 9th as this week begins. Major General Victor Fortune, in charge of the 51st Highland, tries to make for Le Havre, hoping to be evacuated. They are unable to do this, and at Saint-Valery-en-Caux on the morning of the 12th, General Marcel Hillière, commanding the French 9th Corps, gives the surrender order over the protests of the Highland Division. 8,000 British soldiers and some 46,000 Allied soldiers total are taken prisoner that day, including 12 generals. I should note, though, that Operation Cycle is the successful evacuation of 11,059 Allied troops from Le Havre the 10th to the 13th before Rommel arrives the 14th. Further east on the Aisne on the 9th, Rundstedt's Army Group A attacks the newly formed French 4th Army Group under Charles Hunziger. That group contains the last French reserves and was tasked from the 6th with holding the line from Montmedy to Attaché. They are hit with both von Kleist's armor, who's moved over since the French had stopped him further west, and Heinz Guderian's. The French hold the Germans back, though they take heavy losses, and the Germans manage just one bridgehead over the Aisne. It is fairly obvious the French can't hold them for long, though, and they begin to disengage the 11th and pull back towards the Marne. But by this time, first Guderian's and then von Kleist's Panzer Corps have crossed the Aisne and are speeding south, reaching Rennes and making a bridgehead at Chalon-sur-Marne by the end of the day. Paris is now under threat from the west and the north. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill urges the French to make Paris a fortress and fight for every street, since a great city really can absorb huge armies if stubbornly defended. French Deputy Prime Minister Philippe Pétain has this to say: "To make Paris a city of ruins will not affect the issue. French Army Commander Maxime Weygand declares Paris an open city. No army, no barricades, no tanks will await the Germans. The Germans accept this, but only on condition that it includes a larger suburban area, like with Saint-Germain and Versailles. To the north, the 11th Iron Division sacrifices itself in Compiègne Forest to buy time for the French 7th Army to fall back to the Oise. The French are desperately fighting to hold the lower Seine. Now, the 52nd Lowland and part of the 1st Canadian have by now arrived at Cherbourg to help them out. But when Lowland units reach French headquarters the 12th and realize the situation is impossible, they call the British War Office, and on the 13th, Churchill orders the evacuation of all British units from France. By the end of that day, all French forces in the west, the 7th, the 10th, and the Armée de Paris are pulling back to the Loire, and the French government is en route to Tours. From there, they will head for Bordeaux. Churchill has urged French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who who wants to fight on, to appeal to American President Franklin Roosevelt for help. Roosevelt writes back, not a declaration of war, but that the Americans are doing everything in their power to make available to the Allies everything they need. If this is published, it might help French morale and in fact encourage them to fight on, but American Secretary of State Cordell Hull does not allow that. At 9:30 a.m., June 14th, the German flag flies over the Arc de Triomphe. Paris has fallen. At 9:45, German troops march down the Champs-Élysées. 2 million Parisians have fled the city. For the remaining 700,000 or so, a curfew is announced for 8 p.m. On the 15th, Strasbourg and Verdun fall, and as the week ends, Operation Ariel begins. This is the Allied evacuation of personnel from the ports of Western France. There is a one-man evacuation this day as well at the other end of Europe. See, on the 12th, the Soviet Union sends an ultimatum to Lithuania demanding territory and a new Lithuanian government. On the 14th, the Soviet Baltic Fleet blockades the Baltic states. Soviet border troops are ready to organize communist coups in them. Today, the Soviets give Lithuania an 8-hour ultimatum to surrender. Lithuanian President Antanas Smetona leaves the country, though, so that a formal legal takeover is not possible. Kaunas and Vilnius are occupied. And with that occupation, and the Japanese occupation of Yisheng, the week comes to an end. Paris has fallen, the Allied armies have been put to flight, and the Allies are again evacuating. It has not been a good week for the British and French, though here is something that seems to bode well. The Earl of Suffolk is in France this week on a special mission. He is to find and bring to Britain £2.5 million worth of industrial diamonds for machine tooling, also some specific tools for armament making, and also 2 nuclear scientists, Hans von Halban and Lev Kowarski, and 26 cans of heavy water, much of the total world supply, which they think is essential for the construction of some sort of atomic bomb. The Earl and his cohorts get all of this stuff and make it aboard a collier called Broom Park. They set sail, and the ship next to them is sunk by a magnetic mine. They do, however, reach Britain unharmed. Something I didn't mention that happened last week, though, that does not seem to bode well is this. At Charleville, Adolf Hitler explained to his generals that without a navy the equal of Britain's, we could not hold on to her colonies for long. Thus, we can easily find a basis for a peace agreement with Britain. France, on the other hand, must be stamped into the ground. She must pay the bill. And he told General von Rundstedt there, now that Britain will presumably be willing to make peace, I will begin the final settlement of scores with Bolshevism. If you want to learn more about an event in the future of this war involving heavy water and a James Bond-like sabotage action, I did an episode for the Sabaton History Channel about their song Saboteurs right here. Our TimeGhost Army member of the week is Aaron Gulbrandsen. Be like Aaron and join our forces at timeghost.tv or patreon.com to keep the war effort going. Do not forget to subscribe, activate notifications, and I'll see you next time.